being our technician. I'm very happy to introduce Ian Burton today as our first speaker. You've looked at his bio. You've heard from Pat that we're starting with the knowledge that climate change is here, and our day will focus on discussing what we can do now. But I think one of the questions that's probably on all our minds anyway, and may recur during the day, is why didn't we do something before? So although the focus of the day, the subtitle is Ways Forward, it does make sense to start with a historical account of various things that Ian will tell us about, why and how we didn't do all the right things we could have before and what remains to be done. Ian, you'll read on the program and I won't repeat it, is an eminent scholar starting in the Department of Geography, the founder of the School of Environment at U of T, and always interested in disasters and extreme events and exciting things like that, but also asking why, not just how they happened, but why did they happen? Did they have to happen? So we'll be hearing from him on that side of ways forward, what we can do. In 2023, the Government of Canada published a, let me read the exact title, the National Adaptation Strategy. We have one, a National Adaptation Strategy, paired with the National Adaptation Plan. That was the same year that Ian Burton was awarded an Order of Canada. No coincidence there. He's been very active and influential in shaping policy as well as studying things. So Ian, here you are. Here is the podium for you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here in this Wedgwood room, where I think I first came in the 1960s, if I can remember right. Impossible, it seems. I'm going to talk today. Thank you. I'm charged with talking today about the huge and complex topic of adaptation to climate change. But as I look around me, I think it's not only climate change we need to be worried about. So underlying this question of adaptation to just climate change, there's a whole lot of other questions about what we mean by adaptation and how we change ourselves in relation to the circumstances which we find ourselves in. Sometimes I'm thinking we should change the alphabet a little bit, and instead of saying A is for apple, we should say A is for adaptation. How do I go from? To go back to the literature, adaptation refers to adjustments in ecological or environmental, social, or economic systems Thank you. In response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects. This involves changes in processes, practice, and structures to moderate potential damages, or, often overlooked, take advantage of opportunities associated with climate change. Adaptation can be explored through interconnected themes, and it encompasses both practice, policy, and spanning all levels of society, from individuals to global institutions. In practice, it is an enormously complicated and wide issue, and it beleaguers my imagination to imagine that one could deal satisfactorily with it in an hour or two, or for that matter, a day or two. It touches upon all sectors: health, infrastructure, trade, economic policy, all of which need to take into account climate change and its impacts. So it's all those sectors, but it's also all levels. We have to deal with it at the individual level and also up to the global level with all kinds of different institutions. There's a big timing element to it. Adaptation can be based on when action is taken, reactive, concurrent, or anticipatory. And I think I should emphasize that anticipation has a lot to do with what we should do more of now. There is also the question of maladaptation, because a lot of the things that we do can have adverse as well as positive effects. Things that we take with good intentions in terms of adapting to current day climate and anticipated changes can also have longer term adverse effects. I want to talk a little bit about the historical context. Adaptation is sort of climate change, one of the latest issues in relation to a sequence of environmental pollution problems. One of the first ones was the ozone layer depletion problem, and another was the acid rain. Both these were dealt with very strongly by mitigation. We stopped emitting or removed substances that were depleting the ozone layer and causing acid rain, acid precipitation. In 1992, the Earth Summit in Rio saw the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was pretty much dominated by the idea that climate change could be addressed by mitigation. The same initial optimism that climate could address, like those previous pollution issues, ozone layer and acid rain. But eventually came along a recognition that there should be a twofold dichotomy approach, including both mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation says, well, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and replace greenhouse gases with renewable energy and wind, solar, and so on, and also in ideas like carbon pricing. And we could also mitigate, also adapt. But essentially, there was some early resistance to adaptation in the negotiations under the Climate Convention, due to the fear that belief in the capacity of adaptation would undermine the urgency to mitigate. Sorry. What we've seen recently is a substantial rise in the interest in adaptation. From a secondary, sometimes obstructive problem, it is now recognized by the scientific community as a critical pillar of response to climate change. More frequent and severe disasters have made adaptation a necessity. It always was a necessity in relation to those disaster events, but now much more of a necessity, not an option in relation to climate change. So recent agreements and negotiations, IPCC reports, and global agreements like the Paris Agreement of 2015 have emphasized the need for adaptation to take its place alongside mitigation. But I regret to say that these reports and global agreements have been very, very weak in implementation. There are people in this room who know more about this process than I do, and I urge them to explain why the ideas have not been implemented much more strongly and rapidly than they could have been. But adaptation is now seen as a viable cost-saving investment for reducing losses and protecting livelihoods. But this is seen heavily in the science community. If you look at this graph of publications, it shows mitigation, publications on mitigation, rising very rapidly from the early 2000s, and adaptation is following suit rather slowly. But it is now moving forward. But this graph shows publications, not action. It is a graph of peer-reviewed scientific and academic publications only, not real-world policy or practice. Mitigation saw an earlier and more rapid growth in academic publications. Adaptation publications grew later. But this adaptation publications was not translated into widespread political action. The increase in adaptation literature does not necessarily reflect on the ground implementation or political prioritization. And current political discourse around climate change still rarely engages with adaptation in meaningful ways. If you look at the election campaign debates that have been going on in this country and elsewhere, there is still, insofar as climate change is addressed at all, and there's some attempt to push it off the table, the debate rarely engages with adaptation in meaningful ways in the political and policy arena. Let me go back to a little bit of history. That's a bit premature. Initially, climate scientists underestimated the rate of climate change. They had the idea that climate change was going to be a very slow, long-term, incremental process. But in fact, climate change has occurred and progressed much faster than these earlier models predicted, giving us less time than we thought we had to implement needed technologies and policies. Also, adaptation has been viewed as a hindrance to mitigation, a secondary priority. Some believed adaptation could reduce the urgency to cut emissions. Concerns arose that successful adaptation might weaken mitigation efforts. And also, not least, adaptation was difficult to define and to measure, making it harder to implement. these delayed the promotion of adaptation as a key response. So in conclusion, I would say that adaptation is no longer optional. It is essential in responding to climate change. Equitable financing and implementation, especially between the richer and the poorer countries, particularly those in the global south, is essential. Integrating adaptation with mitigation strengthens long-term resilience. We need to do both side by side in combination with each other. Also, it is important to recognize that adaptation strategies vary tremendously by scale, timing, sector, and policy. You need to adapt from local to global now and in an anticipatory way in all the major sectors and policy, each requiring its own tailored approaches and its combination of approaches. And then there is also the dangers of maladaptation, increasing disaster risk. I would just wish, in conclusion, to express my thanks to Thea Dickinson, my colleague and co-worker, who is for her substantial and highly valued contributions to the development of these ideas and this presentation. Thank you very much, Thea, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.